Okay, today we're going to talk about the Cuban Revolution, which is a giant turning point in the Cold War and therefore Latin American history and also U.S. history, especially relating to Latin America, U.S. foreign policy. The Cuban Revolution is fairly simple to understand at its surface. Dictatorship had been in control of Cuba since earlier in the 1950s, led by Fulgencio Batista. The Cuban people generally hated that dictatorship because it was extremely corrupt. It allowed a lot of foreign companies into Cuba, paying very low taxes, paying very low wages. So the country was largely very poor, and the only way that the government could really stay in control of all that was to repress the population and not allow elections, or at least control elections, to make sure that the people that the dictatorship wanted to win the elections would actually win. So it was a pretty hardcore military dictatorship. Anyone who spoke out against it was punished for sedition or speaking out against the people or something like that. So the Batista dictatorship was extremely unpopular among the Cuban people, but it was very much supported by the U.S. government because the dictatorship gave the U.S. really whatever it wanted in the early Cold War, especially by promising to keep communists out of power in Cuba. So the U.S. government liked the Batista dictatorship and supported it, but the general Cuban population did not. And one of the who will emerge as one of the more important people in Cuba that hates the revolution is a guy named Fidel Castro. He's pretty young in the 1950s. He was from an immigrant family of peninsulares in Cuba, which means immigrants who had come from Iberia, from Spain, who had moved to Cuba and had started a business or bought land or something like that, and were generally a middle class type of existence. So that's what Fidel and his brother Raul grew up within. Very kind of normal middle class life. Went to college. Fidel went to law school, got a law degree, so he was a trained lawyer. And just as he was finishing that degree in the early mid 1940s, he started to travel around Latin America and talk with Latin American nationalists. So he leaves Cuba and starts, going country to country and thinking about Latin America in general and the state of Latin America and its relationships with the United States or its government, how it functions. And he was actually in Bogota in 1948 during the major uprisings, the Bogotazo, after Gaetan was killed. And he saw that as a kind of symbolic of a big opportunity for what other Latin Americans should do. The Bogotazo was largely a riot, or a series of riots over several days, but it was an uprising of people who felt poor and oppressed and overwhelmed the city leaders to the point where the people basically took over the city for about 2 days and kicked what they accused of the corrupt city leaders completely out of the city itself. So Fidel is thinking about all this as he returns to Cuba in early 1953, and he got together a bunch of kind of young men who are angry about the Batista dictatorship, and they organize themselves into a little militia of somewhere around 200 soldiers, and they attack a military base in Moncada, which is near Santiago. So about 160, 170 of these very young men, rebels, basically storm the fort. They attack and try to start a Cuban revolution. They lost that battle. Most of them were captured, and the dictatorship's response is pretty severe. It's mostly to kill most of the rebel soldiers and to either on the battlefield or through executions to kill most of them, and they sentence Fidel and his brother Raul to 15 years in prison each. Fidel's attempt at a Cuban revolution seems to have completely failed. But the next year, Batista was continually so unpopular amongst Cubans that he felt, or his advisors felt at least, that a good idea to maybe get some more popularity back would be to give a general amnesty to all political prisoners in Cuba. So Fidel and his brother were released from prison just a year and a half later after they went in. And Fidel then goes to Mexico, largely to try to organize another group of young soldiers for another revolutionary attempt. And this is where Fidel meets a guy named Che Guevara, who himself was in 1954 in Guatemala, so I personally witnessed the U.S. overthrow of President Arbenz in Guatemala in 54. So Che and others from other Latin American countries were very angry about all this stuff, and they secretly start forming a revolutionary attempt to go back into Cuba and start a guerrilla war to overthrow the Batista dictatorship. So they land in 1956 in Cuba, and they immediately go into the mountainous areas in eastern Cuba, basically to hide in the mountains and organize themselves and start a guerrilla war against the government. So this is the beginning of the second revolution. Fidel knows that it's going to be really difficult just with about 30 or 40 soldiers at first to overthrow an entire government. So one of his big strategies is to give interviews with not just Cuban newspaper writers, but also foreign newspaper writers, reporters, even from the United States. And he invited photographers to take pictures of their training and their kind of attacks on small bands of government troops and things like that. So he wants to create a kind of media image as a revolutionary and kind of romantic reformer who mostly just hates how brutal and incompetent and horrible the Batista dictatorship is for the Cuban people, who doesn't really want power for himself. So Castro keeps talking about how I'm doing this for the Cuban people, not for my own benefit. And I mean, it's received pretty well amongst reporters because this is a very kind of romantic, fun story about these young men that are willing to give their lives for the general benefit of the population. So it's a really kind of heartwarming story for a lot of people, and also for a lot of readers in the United States. It exposes a lot of things that a lot of Americans didn't really know all that much about. The U.S. government's been supporting these dictatorships in Latin America, but the U.S. general population doesn't know the details of that. And things like the U.S. overthrowing the Guatemalan government, that's all top secret stuff. So there's some suspicions out there amongst scholars or other people among the U.S. population who pay close attention to this. But the American population in general doesn't know what its government is doing in Latin America for the most part. So that's another thing that a lot of American readers are interested in, is just that someone's accusing the U.S. government of having done this in the first place. So Fidel, in these interviews, talks about always wanting to keep the poor Cuban peasants in mind first, that they're doing this all for the poor, and that the guerrilla movement, the revolutionary movement, should never betray the poor or try to oppress the poor or take advantage of them or anything like that, because at that point, what's the point in starting a revolution if your goal is to overthrow a horrible government and then you basically do the same things that the bad government was doing? Is basically no change. You just have a change in leadership, but the policies are basically the same. So he gives these statements to newspaper reporters, invites photographers to take pictures like this of he and his troops this looks like they're like debating like how they're going to overthrow the government, what kind of government would be best or something like that, instead of they're not lined up and Castro's not giving orders to march or anything like that, the normal things that we think about when we think of military training. So he gets a lot of popularity amongst Cuban people, but no one is willing to vocally support him, because if you do, that's breaking Cuban law and you can be arrested for that. But amongst themselves, a lot of poor Cubans talk about Castro and the revolutionary movement. It's tiny at this point, it's just getting going, but it's gaining some notoriety just because of the media campaign. The problem for the Revolutionary Army is that the poor peasants don't really join the guerrilla army in very large numbers, and they never held any leadership roles during the revolution in the guerrilla army, the revolutionary force. So they can often, the rebels may often talk about keeping the poor in mind and doing everything for the poor, but in the end their army is not made up of the poor. So there's a disconnect between what they're saying and what their real daily experience might be. This revolution gets going again at about 1956 at the very beginning. Really for the first year they're just trying to survive. Word is out that there's a revolutionary movement of soldiers out hiding out in the mountains, and they launch some kind of hit and run attacks against different military bases or convoys of troops or supply routes or something like that. But they're basically just barely surviving for about the first year. And then, because this media campaign created so much kind of public pressure in the United States on the U.S. Congress to do something about the Batista dictatorship that's oppressing the Cuban people, the U.S. government Congress created an arms embargo. So they pass a law saying that U.S. government and U.S. companies are not allowed to sell weapons to the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. So that takes effect in March 1958. And again, that's largely because of public and media pressure on the U.S. government to do something to try to convince the Batista dictatorship to be better, put some kind of pressure on them. So that gets going in early 1958. The next month, Castro and the rebels called for a general strike starting in April 1958, hoping that if the Cuban people just stay home, they don't go to work, they don't buy things, they can destroy their own economy and force the Batista government to resign. That attempt at a general strike failed. Some people do stay home, but the problem when you ask very poor people to go on strike is a lot of them feel so desperate to make any amount of money they can that for the people who stay home, there's suddenly a bunch of jobs open that other poor people flood into because they're barely on the edge of survival. So the general strike in April 1958 failed. And at that point, the Batista government started what Batista himself called a, quote, liquidation campaign, end quote, to completely annihilate the guerrilla soldiers that are out in the mountains. So Batista's theory at this point is he should just send the army into the mountains and try to locate where the rebels are hiding and just annihilate them. But the big military campaign that gets going, mostly in summer 1958, is basically a disaster for the government. The army leaders seem to be pretty incompetent. They had trouble finding the rebels in the mountains at all. And the rebels themselves are completely dedicated to their cause. They're not surrendering. They're not taking any kind of plea deals or cop-outs or anything like that. They're there to fight to the death. So their dedication versus the military incompetence of the Cuban army, basically the Cuban army went into the mountains in the early summer of 1958, and the rebels pushed them out of the mountains militarily by the end of August. Batista, by August 1958, is getting absolutely desperate to figure out some way of defeating this growing, increasingly popular revolutionary sentiment throughout the whole country. Virtually all Cubans have heard of the revolution by this point. Some people quit their jobs and they go out into the eastern mountains and try to find the rebels to join the army. So the rebel army is growing. The effectiveness of the government's army is shrinking. And the general population is aware of the revolution and start kind of speaking out in public in support of it. So Batista feels at this point that he has to start repressing the population that supports the revolution, even just by saying so in public. So he sends his spy networks out into the general population. They start arresting anyone who speaks in favor of the revolution in public, even, not just standing up and giving a speech to try to rally support among the population for the revolution, but also students at a university who might be hanging out talking about it, people hanging out in bars or coffee houses or something who might be sitting around talking about it, groups of workers talking about it on their break. So he's going far and wide into the Cuban population to arrest and generally attack anyone who vocally supports the revolution, and that seems to be where the general population of Cuba turns against Batista and turn to really hate him deeply and start demanding his resignation. And a lot of people at this point in later 1958 are getting so angry that more calls for a general strike or a boycott or something start to take effect, and this generally grinds down the individual businesses in Cuba and generally the whole Cuban economy all the way down to a halt. No foreign investors wanted to put money into Cuban factories or anything like that because they're worried that the revolution might succeed and that the government might fall. So the combination of a plunging economy and surging popular support for the revolution toward the end of 1958 and collapsing government ability to repress any support for the revolution pushes Batista to resign on December 31st, 1958, late in the evening, getting close to New Year's Day, and Batista and several of his government leaders leave Cuba entirely. They leave the country to avoid being arrested or punished for all the things that they had done. So on New Year's Day, 1960, you have a new government. And the new government is pretty wide open because the Batista dictatorship had taken in virtually all of the politicians in Cuba. They were all members of it somehow or other, and it all kind of been compromised some way or other. So the public anger at the government spread to virtually all existing Cuban politicians before Castro started this revolution. So virtually the whole so-called political class is really stained by their relationship with the Batista government. So the only group that had any real political or government-type legitimacy in Cuba on New Year's Day 1959 is really the rebel army. And with Castro at its head and its most famous media personality, a lot of Cubans look directly to Castro himself to decide what the new government will look like, and he immediately starts proclaiming that he's going to lead a kind of provisional government until some long-term structures are put in place, and that he keeps saying he doesn't want to keep power for himself forever, that he just wants to be around for really the first few months to create a structure, a new government that could kind of take over and run the government well for the benefit of all people equally. So, the poor and the working class Cubans, they very much supported Castro in a lot of these statements, largely because they hated the Batista government so much, and they never had much voice in that former government anyway. The middle classes, say doctors and lawyers and teachers and people like that, hadn't had so much contact and hadn't really been involved in the Batista dictatorship so much. A lot of them are government employees like teachers, but just to be a teacher doesn't mean that you personally support the dictatorship. It just means that you want to teach classes for a living, and that's what you want your job to be. So a lot of middle classes seem to have hated the dictatorship really throughout. And they had kept their distance from it. So at this point they start talking about wanting more social justice, and especially wanting to have a government in Cuba that's completely independent from U.S. influence. So much like many other revolutionary governments that we've seen throughout history, the first big decision that the new government in Cuba under Castro has to make is really what to do with the former advisors and politicians and military leaders from the Batista dictatorship that are still in the country, that hadn't fled. And the normal solution, at least for the first couple months or so, is called perdón, which means to the wall. which generally means anyone who had had a leadership role in the Batista dictatorship is executed. So they put him up against the wall and shoot him. So that's what to the wall means. And in the first few months, historians estimate that somewhere around 600 or so former Batista government officials are executed. So there is a major repressive movement to destroy the last vestiges of the Batista dictatorship and make sure that they can never come back. And of course that angers a lot of people, especially family members and other elites who have personal relationships with the people that were executed or jailed. But that often happens in revolutions. When the revolutionaries succeed, they largely purge the former dictatorship leaders because they're so afraid that those former advisors will get together and conspire to overthrow the revolution and put the old system back in place. Fidel himself basically goes on an international tour in spring 1959. He goes to the United Nations in New York, gives a speech about what the Cuban Revolution is about and what the new government wants to do. He gives speeches at Harvard University in Boston, basically taking questions from students, talking about Latin American history and U.S. influence over Latin America and how he thinks it should be undone. And a lot of U.S. college students listen to this, and many of them start to agree. So Castro is kind of on tour and also doing media interviews at the same time to project a kind of Cuban nationalist, but generally just a reformist type image. He keeps saying again that he did the revolution for the Cuban people. He doesn't want to stay in power himself. He doesn't want to be a dictator. He doesn't really want to be a lifetime politician. He just wants to create the opportunity for a new Cuban government to establish more kind of independence and start making their own decisions. And he very carefully avoided talking about communism or many economic policies that could be associated with communism, because he sees what the U.S. government does to other leaders like Arbenz in Guatemala when the U.S. government starts accusing them of getting too, quote, communistic, end quote. Fidel returns to Cuba in May 1959 and pushes through probably the biggest legal reform of the early months, which becomes known as the Agrarian Reform Law. So this passes in May 1959 after a couple of weeks of debates and whatnot. Has some really big pieces to it, but in general it's a kind of land reform law that we've seen in other places in Latin America in different times. The government decides that anyone who owns over 1,000 acres of land, no individual person or family needs more than 1,000 acres. 1,000 acres is a huge piece of land. It's well enough to get rich off of in the first place. So this land reform law says that any land ownership over 1,000 acres, the government will confiscate the land that you have in excess of 1,000 acres. So you get to keep your first 1,000, but you have to give up the rest. And it's not like the government's just seizing the land and taking it. The government does pay the landowners for the land that they were taking. So they pay them mostly in Cuban government bonds, which are basically a document that says that you have kind of loaned a bunch of money to the Cuban government and you're going to be paid back on a yearly basis with interest. The law also outlawed foreigners from owning land in Cuba. Again, mostly afraid that foreign businesses and individuals could come in and buy up too much Cuban land and therefore take a foothold in the Cuban economy and try to start dominating the Cuban economy. So a lot of this is very clearly at economic independence from foreign countries. And the law also created a National Institute of Agrarian Reform to carry out the land redistributions, and mostly to break up the lands that the government seized into kind of small plots to give out to individual families, individual peoples, kind of small-scale landowners, and even cooperatives of different landowners if they applied that way. And of course, the U.S. government hates all this stuff because a lot of U.S. companies are going to start losing land, and U.S. citizens will start losing a lot of land in Cuba being seized to the government. So they make contact with U.S. government leaders and say, what's going on here? You have to stop it. And of course, the U.S. government comes up with its normal line that anything like this is communism, or is the first step toward communism. And those complaints from the U.S. government grew even louder when the new Cuban government appointed a member of the Communist Party to run the National Institute that carries out the land redistributions. So this is where the U.S. government starts to say that communists are taking over the Cuban government, and this is the spread of communism to Cuba must be stopped because of the Cold War. The Cubans themselves start calling for elections by mid-1959, so after this law passes. Castro himself kept promising elections repeatedly. So by May, June 1959, it's been a good going on 5-6 months of promises to hold elections, but Castro kept finding reasons to delay the elections. And his most popular excuse, the one he uses over and over again, is that there's some kind of conspiracy out there amongst the population to try to overthrow the revolution and bring back the Batista dictatorship. So he's afraid that if they hold elections right now at this moment, then people involved in that conspiracy will try to win the election and go into the new Cuban government with the intent of overthrowing it. So he says that we have to delay the elections for a while until we can find and arrest these conspirators, these anti-revolutionary conspirators, and make sure that they can't do the damage that they plan on doing to this new government that is for the people. Some former politicians, some had even been involved in the Batista dictatorship, start speaking out against the land reform law, and they start publicly saying that communists are moving into the new government, and they're starting to take control over the Revolutionary Army and start taking bureaucratic roles within the kind of government structure, and that riled up a lot of the population. At this point, Castro was fairly embarrassed in summer of 1959, so he announced his resignation from what he called the premiership, the kind of leadership of the provisional government. So he said he was going to resign, and he said, basically, if people don't like what I'm doing, I'll quit, I'll go back home, and you guys can kind of take over from here. And then his major supporters throughout Cuba started holding big rallies in different Cuban cities, trying to convince him to return to lead the provisional government, and to convince the people who were complaining about Castro to accept that by showing that these rallies reveal that the mass population of poor Cubans want Castro to continue in power. And that succeeds. Castro comes back based on that kind of wave of popularity, and that will be a tool that he will use throughout the decades in order to stay in power, where he will say, okay, if you don't like what I'm doing, I'm done, I quit. And then in the background, we'll try to kind of whip up his supporters to hold these mass rallies again all over Cuba to demonstrate that he still has popular support. And then he'll come back and reassume office again. So he'll do this many times over the decades. That's his strategy for retaining political power. But some politicians and even people within his Revolutionary Army started to criticize Castro and this kind of deceitful type of strategy to stay in power, and also formally start saying that yes, there are communists that are moving into the government, and it looks like the Cuban Revolution is starting to move toward more communism. One of his head lieutenants in the Revolutionary Army, Uber Matos, started saying this publicly, and Castro had him jailed, had him arrested, basically on sedition charges, and has him basically found guilty. And Castro also started a massive propaganda campaign to discredit Matos. and convinced the Cuban population that he was a traitor to the revolution. So Castro at this point is starting to take the stance that anyone who speaks out against Castro or against the idea of communism is therefore against what is good for the people, and is therefore against the revolution and should therefore be jailed. So Matos will stay in prison for 20 years based on these charges, and around 1980 he'll be released and he'll go to Miami in the United States, and will talk openly from there in the media about how bad the Cuban government had become under Castro. So many anti-Castro Cubans define Matos as kind of symbolic of how bad Castro and the government have become, that they're basically setting up an authoritarian system, like a Stalinist repressive system to run Cuba. Castro starts talking about, writing a new constitution or bringing back an old constitution that Batista had overthrown in 1952. So Castro talks about a lot of different things, setting up new government structures, but he will often kind of put those ideas to the side whenever those ideas conflict with what he wants for the social revolution to help poor people. So he could talk about writing a new constitution until there's some kind of conflict between the constitutional powers of the government and what he wants to do on a daily basis. So he often talks about just taking revolutionary control over what he called the bourgeois systems of control in mid 1900s, really anywhere that is industrialized. Bourgeois systems like factories and media and the court systems and universities and lower level schools, and also particularly labor unions. So he said that all those were largely controlled by the bourgeoisie. Karl Marx's old enemy, the rich factory owners who have so much money they don't have to work. They sit in their houses and go to parties, and they might manage their company a little bit for a few hours a day, but they're not the hard-working Cubans who really keep the economy going. So Castro largely relies on his army, his soldiers, that still support him, and keeps delaying elections to the point where no elections are really held for decades in Cuba. So it's over and over again. It's kind of cyclical system where people demand elections, and he says again there's this anti-revolutionary plot, and so he can't hold elections and just kind of delays it. And in 1960, the revolutionary government created a thing called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which starts off as really local groups of Cuban citizens who organize for what we call civil defense, which means Cuba has a formal army that they're building up to defend the country against invasion. But if a big enough invasion happens to where the army cannot defeat it, then the individual citizens in different cities and towns have to have some amount of low-level military training so that they can have access to weapons in order to start basically a nationwide guerrilla movement to kick out any foreign occupier. So that's what these committees largely start off as, individual local citizen groups who are training to start any kind of movement against a possible invasion and occupation of Cuba. But within a few months, it starts to kind of transform also into local groups that are looking for counter-revolutionaries, people that are against Castro and the new government, who might be secretly plotting to bring back Batista or some other repressive dictatorship. And at this point, Castro and the new government are equating any level of anti-Castro or anti-communist ideology with anti-revolutionary sentiment, which means that they are, criminal, basically. So again, Castro is saying that anyone who speaks out against Castro, who speaks out against communism, is therefore speaking out against the entire revolution. And if the revolution is fought for the benefit of all people, then if you're speaking out against the revolution, then you are logically against the people, and you should be jailed, or that should be illegal. So those are several kind of big logical leaps. But that's how he lines up the ideas in order to kind of claim the power to, go after people who spoke out against him. Castro, he has a lot of good intentions, especially kind of social justice type things. He does, for the first few years, really build up government systems to attack the things that are really a plague on poor communities and poor nations. Things like hunger, illiteracy, mass poverty, low wages, bad housing, bad roads, disease, just this whole long list of what tends to happen in poor communities when they make so little money that they can't afford to go to a hospital, they can't afford enough food to eat, they can't afford decent housing. Castro does use the new government to build up schools, to build up hospitals and roads and public housing and a lot of things that really go after a lot of the epidemic problems that are related to mass poverty. And he's fairly successful at doing those. Cuba's hospital system will become one of the best in all of Latin America and will remain so for decades. The public housing system will become one of the better ones throughout all of Latin America. So he, even with a lot of the political repression that he's starting to do by, say, 1960 or so, early 60s, he's still fairly popular because his government is very successful at doing all these other things on this list. It really angered a lot of the rich people in Cuba because their land's been confiscated. A lot of their family members who are angry about their land being confiscated have been jailed for speaking out against the government. So a lot of the rich Cubans start to emigrate. They start to leave Cuba by the early 1960s. And for Cubans who leave Cuba, if they own property, the government will confiscate their abandoned property. The government basically says that these people don't want to be Cubans anymore because they speak out against the people, so they've left. And we're not just going to leave their land and their houses, sitting there vacant. So the government takes over those, what they say are abandoned properties, and the government will run them. And the rich Cubans are, they're not saying that they stand against the Cuban people and they're opposed to the government because the rich are just greedy rich people and they hate any government that's going to take their stuff. No, the rich people who leave Cuba say that they're fleeing oppression, that they don't have freedom of speech anymore, and they don't have freedom of property, and Castro is not allowing democratic elections to happen, so they say that they're fleeing an authoritarian government, a dictatorship. So they have a pretty good argument on their side also. And the giant turning point seems to happen in 1960. The Cuban government under Castro will start getting closer and closer to communism until it becomes an official kind of government policy. So this largely starts off with a trade deal that Cuba negotiates and completes with the Soviet Union in early 1960, around February. So Cuba agrees to sell massive amounts of sugar, somewhere around the level of $100 million worth of sugar per year to the Soviet government, in exchange for credit to import Soviet technology and industrial equipment, largely to start building up an industrial revolution in Cuba. And like we've seen in other Latin American countries, of course, industrialization is seen as the centerpiece of building up national independence and power. So Castro signed that deal, which angered the United States, and then starts forming closer and closer alliances with the Soviet Union. And Castro starts talking about, quote, egalitarian socio-economic policy, end quote, which a lot of people in the United States say, well, it's a lot of big fancy words that basically means communism. And from that point forward, Castro will start nationalizing most of the Cuban economy. So the government is taking over private factories, private land, all kinds of private businesses, and making people who used to own them into government employees. So that is very close to communism. So he's going closer and closer and closer to it, and the United States is getting more and more alarmed about it. And next, Castro made the decision to buy crude oil pumped out of the Soviet Union at discounted rates, which means he can buy cheaper crude oil from the Soviet Union than even closer countries to Cuba and Latin America, often that have U.S. backing. So Castro decides that the Cuban oil industry should import its crude oil from the Soviet Union instead from these U.S. puppets around Latin America. So he ordered the Cuban refiners to only refine Soviet crude oil, which angers a whole lot of U.S. oil companies because the U.S. companies own some of those refineries in Cuba, and so there's a conflict between the government order to only buy crude oil from the Soviet Union and these U.S. businesses who don't want to do that. And the next step is that Castro basically nationalizes any U.S. oil company in Cuba who refused to buy that Soviet crude oil. That really angers the U.S. government because oil investors are some extremely powerful political interest in the United States, and they go directly to U.S. Congress and the White House and say you have to do something about this. And the U.S. does do something about that. The United States stops Cuba's sugar quota in the U.S. market. So basically stops U.S. businesses from purchasing sugar made in Cuba. That really can do a lot of damage to the Cuban sugar economy and the Cuban economy in general. So Castro responds in this kind of back and forth economic policy. He responds by seizing all remaining U.S. property in Cuba. So anything that U.S. businesses or U.S. citizens owned in Cuba, Castro has the Cuban government just take it all. So by the end of 1960, the United States responds to that with a full embargo of all Cuban-made products. So the U.S. will make it illegal for any U.S. entity, business, citizen, anything, to sell goods to Cuba. So that's what an embargo is. It makes it illegal for businesses from your country to send your goods to another place. And that hits all U.S. products except for food or medicine. And that's the famous embargo that is intended to strangle the Cuban economy and force Castro and the communists out of office. So those are the major turning points in 1960 throughout the years, step by step, that pushed the Cuban and U.S. governments toward a very adversarial relationship. And from that point forward also, the United States will start planning and plotting and conspiring ways to overthrow Castro and the Cuban government and put someone else in charge, basically. So the United States government never really accepted the Cuban Revolution very much. The U.S. government worried about the Cuban Revolution when it succeeded in late 58, early 59, and became increasingly concerned because of Castro's economic policy, putting more and more communists into the new government. But 1960 is the big turning point, where the U.S. government basically defines the Castro revolutionary movement as a communist movement. And the United States hates that movement because it's become communist, or the U.S. is defining it as communist. And the United States is absolutely paranoid of any communist uprising or new government in any part of Latin America, because the United States wants to control Latin America for resources and markets, and use it as a kind of natural resource base to fuel the U.S. economy and grow U.S. industry and U.S. prosperity, and hopefully win the Cold War. So that's general U.S. economic policy throughout Latin America. So U.S. leaders are very worried about any kind of revolutionary movement growing and succeeding in what the U.S. calls its backyard, which means all of Latin America. The United States considers the Western Hemisphere to be kind of property of the United States, basically. That no foreign country should have any influence, especially anywhere from Europe or any other world region. And that's been U.S. policy for a long time, going all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine that we've talked about before. So the United States is very worried about what some historians call the, quote, danger of a good example, end quote, of some Latin American indigenous group successfully overthrowing a U.S.-supported dictatorship and then starting a new government where the people of that country will determine for themselves independently what kind of economy they want to have, how they're going to build that economy, and how independent of the United States they can become or stay. So the United States government is afraid of all that stuff, doesn't want that to happen, and Castro is doing it. So Castro becomes like a giant boogeyman to the United States for all of Latin America, and the United States takes the stance that they have to destroy Castro in order to show Latin Americans throughout the whole region that the United States will not accept any anti-U.S. movement, and that anyone who tries it will be destroyed. So the U.S. says, yes, we've been successful in destroying other movements, but if just one of them succeeds, that'll be an inspiration to other Latin Americans to try it themselves in their own countries. And Castro's survival and whatever successes he has economically is a lesson to other Latin Americans that they can also do that in their own countries. So the U.S. is very worried about all this stuff. And the U.S. obviously, with the Cold War, is saying that if you have communism start in one place, that'll inspire movements in other places, and before you know it, you get this domino thing where one country after another falls to communism, and before you know it, communism has taken over another world region, and it might win the Cold War eventually if it keeps doing that. And of course, the U.S. government combines all these kind of general foreign policy worries with anger at Castro's nationalization of U.S. property and building what's increasingly looking like a communist economy in Cuba. And that Cuba is really close to the United States. It's only 90 miles away from Florida. So the U.S. government looks at Cuba having some alliances with the Soviet Union as basically the Soviet Union creating a kind of military base, possibly just 90 miles from the U.S. border. So the Eisenhower administration that's still in office in the late 50s, going into the election of 1960, the U.S. administration starts planning some type of invasion of Cuba, but doesn't want to use U.S. soldiers itself. Wants to use Cubans who hate Castro, and so the U.S. government starts kind of organizing a bunch of anti-Castro Cubans, largely in Florida, and gives them military training. It's all very secret, and starts planning to send them back to Cuba to try to overthrow the Castro government. And if Cubans can do that themselves, supposedly in kind of world opinion, then that will mean that Castro wasn't ever that popular. But the United States realizes if they just send in the U.S. Army to overthrow the Cuban government, that just looks like they're U.S. taking Cuba as a colony. So the United States wants to regain control over Cuba and destroy Castro's movement, but doesn't want it to look like the U.S. is behind all this stuff. Wants to make it look like a kind of natural uprising of Cubans themselves. So the U.S. is plotting all that throughout 1960, and that's an election year. And in the presidential debates, the sitting president, Eisenhower, served 2 terms, so he can't run for re-election. So his vice president, Nixon, is running as Republican for the presidency, and the Democrat, Senator John Kennedy from Massachusetts, is running for the Democrats. And Cuba becomes a central point in the presidential debates in late 1960, going into the November elections. Kennedy was way more aggressive. Kennedy talks about trying to overthrow Castro. Kennedy talks about what he would do if he was in office. Whereas Nixon, he's vice president. He knows that there's already plans going on, but these are so all top secret, so he can't really talk about them in public. So Nixon seems kind of more passive on Cuba, and Kennedy keeps accusing Nixon of being too passive on Cuba. And so Kennedy barely wins the election and will go into office as president of the U.S. in January of '61, largely based on this very aggressive foreign policy stance of figuring out a way of getting rid of Castro and making sure that Cuba does not go toward communism. And when Kennedy gets in office in late January '61, he is told about this top secret plot to overthrow the Cuban government, all these Cubans that are being trained in Florida, and he allows it to continue. So he signs off on it. The plot is basically for Cubans to land at a certain place with U.S. weapons and U.S. training, and that when the Cuban army, when Castro's army comes out to fight them, that U.S. Air Force planes will fly overhead and drop bombs on Castro's army to destroy them, so that the anti-Castro rebels will have basically a free hand to get to the capital city and overthrow the government. So a lot of this is very dependent on the United States sending in its Air Force to help. And at the very last minute, Kennedy vetoed using U.S. planes to do that, because he said it would be too obvious that the United States had done that. So when the anti-Castro Cubans that the CIA has trained actually land at a place called the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961, and you can see that here with the red dot on the map. Number one, the U.S. air support does not show up, and number two, it seems pretty obvious that Castro's spies had found out what was going on, so they knew the exact day and time and place that the U.S. trained forces were going to land, and the Cuban army was there ready to fight and defeated them pretty easily right there on the beach. So a lot of them are killed, the rest are taken captive, and Castro finds out that several of these guys that are captured were actually former government leaders and members and advisors to the Batista dictatorship. And so when he finds that out, of course, he has them kind of paraded on Cuban television, and to prove that the United States had created this force specifically to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and put a new kind of Batista-esque government dictatorship back in office in order so that the United States can control Cuba again. So that's all pretty obvious by this point after the battle at the Bay of Pigs. So this was hugely embarrassing to Kennedy. Kennedy basically is forced to go on national television in the United States and say that, yes, this was all backed by the United States. It was planned by the previous president, but he carried it out, so he said he took full responsibility for it. And after that, he's very embarrassed by it, so he realized the U.S. population does not really support a lot of those kinds of moves. So from this point forward, U.S. foreign policy becomes to figure out other top secret ways of trying to destroy the Castro government. And this becomes known as Operation Mongoose, that gets started in about mid-1961 and comes up with all kinds of crazy conspiracies and plots to do damage to the Cuban economy, to do all kinds of things. So one of the kind of central pieces of Operation Mongoose, which basically the CIA runs, is to train up to 15,000 anti-Castro Cubans, send them into Cuba in bits and pieces, in small groups, and then once they're kind of assembled in Cuba itself, for them to basically launch terrorism warfare against the Cuban economy and government, things like machine gun attacks on Cuban hotels, sabotaging Cuban factories, those types of things. Some of these plots involve personal attacks against Castro himself, assassination plots, sometimes involving mafia figures that used to have a place in Cuba. And some of these assassination plots or embarrassment plots get so kind of ridiculous that they almost seem cartoonish. Like the CIA created Cuban cigars, because Castro is known to love cigars, fake cigars that he would smoke for a little while but had some kind of dynamite or explosive in it, so that as he's smoking the cigar it would blow his head off. So that's a little Bugs Bunny-ish. There's also, the CIA came up with a chemical that they thought they could somehow get a spy into Castro's inner circle, where they can spread the chemical on the clothes he planned to wear the next day, so that his skin would imbibe the chemical that would make his hair fall out. So his very kind of famous revolutionary beard would fall out, and that the CIA thought that might embarrass him so much within the Cuban culture that he would be forced to resign, and that alone would help overthrow the Cuban government. So a lot of this stuff is kind of pretty ridiculous. Another plot had a U.S. submarine that would surface in Havana port on All Saints Day, which is a very religious holiday for Catholics, and launch fireworks up into the sky to signify the second coming of Christ, which would supposedly inspire the Cuban people to rise up somehow. Another plot had U.S. planes would fly over the Cuban population and drop leaflets with pictures portraying Castro as kind of old and fat and living a very luxurious, lavish lifestyle in order to try to destroy public support for Castro. Another one was that, even kind of crazier, was that U.S. planes would fly over Cuba and drop plane tickets on U.S. airlines, prepaid, just onto large population centers, so that poor Cubans who don't like being in Cuba can just go to the nearest airport and get on a plane and go to the United States. So again, there's many different kind of crazy conspiracies that the CIA is coming up with, and it also shows us how desperate they felt to get rid of Castro and get rid of communism in Cuba. The Cuban government, a few decades later, estimated that there were over 600 different individual assassination plots against Castro, and it's really hard to verify on the U.S. side if that number is true or not, because we still don't have access to CIA archives that would prove it or disprove it. And that leads us into the next section, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will be a culmination of a lot of these assassination plots and paranoia on the side of the U.S. government, but also the Soviets play a big role in this. So the U.S. government hates the Cuban Revolution because they view it as a possible symbolic example to other Latin American groups that hate living under U.S.-supported dictatorships or governments or whatever, that they can do this also in their own country, that they can start a revolutionary movement just like Castro had, and they can start a guerrilla movement, and they can overthrow a government that they hate that has full U.S. support. So the U.S. wants to destroy Castro and the Cuban government Castro has created, specifically for those reasons. And the Soviets, on the flip side, they want to protect Castro and the Cuban government for the exact same reason, because he is a symbol amongst other Latin Americans that they can do the same thing in their own countries. So the Soviets want to protect Castro, the Cuban government, and its growing, increasingly communist economy, because the Soviets feel that it's a great example to other Latin Americans that they can do it too. And the Soviets want to promote the idea that you can build communism, that communism works at some level economically, to alleviate poverty and disease and hunger and a lot of those kinds of things that many Latin American populations are suffering from. So the United States wants to destroy the Castro government, and the Soviets want to protect it for equal and very similar reasons. And the Soviet leader at this point is named Nikita Khrushchev. You see him in this picture on the left. talking with Kennedy at a conference in '61. Khrushchev feels that the best way to protect the Cuban government will be to send in some Soviet military units, Soviet soldiers basically, to help defend Cuba against a possible U.S. invasion. And of course, in the Cold War, when one country sends its own troops into one of its allied countries, that is usually enough to stop the other side from attacking, because nobody wants to start World War III, which could become a nuclear war very quickly if they're actively attacking each other and killing each other's soldiers. And Khrushchev hits on the idea that not just sending Soviet troops into Cuba will work, but also to send Soviet nuclear weapons into Cuba under Soviet soldiers' control, of course. And so Khrushchev takes the decision in summer 1962 to send Soviet soldiers and engineers to build missile launch sites in Cuba and to put atomic bombs on those missiles to convince the United States to never attack Cuba, to try to overthrow the Cuban government. So Khrushchev feels that this is a defensive maneuver to protect Castro and the Cuban communists from an American attack. So those missile sites start being constructed in summer 1962. U.S. spy planes, CIA planes basically, they fly over foreign airspace quite often, and they take pictures, and they realize by October 1962 that the Soviets are doing this, that they're building missile launch sites. Kennedy goes on national TV and tells the U.S. public, and therefore the world, that U.S. spy planes have detected this, they realize what it is, and that this is a danger, Kennedy says, to world peace, because any missile launched from Cuba has about a 5-minute period of time before that missile hits Washington, D.C. So Kennedy says that this is totally unacceptable, and Kennedy tells the U.S. public that something has to be done. We now know internally that Kennedy personally vetoed a U.S. military plan to send in the U.S. Marines to invade Cuba outright that week. So that was something the U.S. military wanted to do. And Kennedy said no, because once we send in the Army, they might launch those missiles. So Kennedy has avoided potential nuclear war just at that point. We know that for pretty well certain. Kennedy says that this is so dangerous, this 5-minute fly time, that something has to be done to convince the Soviets to take their missiles out of Cuba. So what Kennedy says instead is he's going to create what he calls a, quote, quarantine. He's going to send the U.S. Navy in to surround Cuba, just sit out there in the waters around Cuba, and stop more Soviet ships from taking missile supplies into Cuba. So Kennedy calls this quarantine. We would usually call that a blockade. But Kennedy doesn't use that word because a blockade is a formal act of war. And one thing about this quarantine is that the Soviet ships are already in the ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean, heading toward Cuba. There's more ships on the way. So when Kennedy announces his quarantine and that the U.S. Navy is going to take up this posture surrounding Cuba, it basically creates a countdown. When will the Soviet ships get to Cuba and, under orders, try to get to Cuba through the blockade, through the quarantine? When exactly will that happen? And some estimates come out. It's going to be like, I don't know, Tuesday at 11 a.m. or something like that, because the fear is that once those Soviet military ships get to the point where they make contact with the U.S. Navy, there's a very real possibility that they're going to start fighting. And their fighting on the waters outside Cuba could quickly escalate to World War III, which could turn into a nuclear war, wherein the United States and Soviet Union might completely annihilate each other with their atomic bombs, and might take the rest of the Northern Hemisphere with them. And the Northern Hemisphere includes all of Europe and much of Northern Africa. So this could kill billions of people, potentially, if this war escalates just because the Soviet ships contact the U.S. Navy outside of Cuba. So a lot of people for several days after this speech are basically on a countdown to the end of the world. And that's not a kind of over-exaggeration or anything. I mean, that is front-page news. It's being talked about constantly. There's several days, I think there's 4 or 5 days, where people are just waiting and hoping that this doesn't happen. Kennedy sends his people at the UN, gives them the pictures, and so over these several days, the U.S. ambassador to the UN publicizes all this stuff and shows the pictures and all this direct evidence, trying to drum up world support for what the United States is trying to do. The world is very scared of this, though, because a lot of world opinion says, well, if the Cuban government wants to let Soviet ships come into its territory, who are you to stop it? So the world is sitting on countdown for several days. This was an extremely scary thing. It's probably the closest we've ever come to nuclear war, or full-scale nuclear war, excluding the U.S. dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan at the end of World War II. Each of the nuclear missiles by the early 1960s, the atomic bombs were about 1,000 times more powerful than what had destroyed those 2 Japanese cities in 1945. And thankfully, we now know that a secret deal was negotiated between Kennedy and Khrushchev's advisors. And the secret deal is that the United States would remove its own missiles from Turkey, which similarly had about, I think, a 10 or 15-minute fly time to Moscow, which were outdated and scheduled to be replaced anyway, in exchange for Khrushchev removing the missiles from Cuba. So that deal was reached in a few hours or so before the Soviet ships were kind of on pace to make contact with the U.S. Navy outside of Cuba. That's how the whole Cuban Missile Crisis ended. And most U.S. historians based in the United States argue that Kennedy did the right thing to, take a brave stance against communism in Latin America and keep the missiles out, and that he was a great military leader and all these things. But other historians say that Kennedy risked worldwide nuclear Armageddon, basically the end of the world, in order to ensure that one communist leader and government in one country in Latin America could survive. Other historians around the world, and even some in the United States, say that Kennedy took some really bad risks. Basically that he was willing to start a nuclear war, or take the risk of starting a nuclear war that could destroy the entire United States, at least, if not more larger parts of the entire world population, in order to guarantee his continuing efforts to destroy and remove one communist leader, one communist government in one country in Latin America. So comparatively, destroying the world in order to retain the ability to try to overthrow one government doesn't seem like a very kind of intelligent risk to a lot of historians, and seems like a very aggressive military move that did not consider the will or even the safety of the U.S. population, much less the rest of the world population. So many historians are very critical of Kennedy, but you often don't hear that story in the United States itself. Khrushchev, for himself, in the Soviet Union, claims that his overall policy was successful. His goal was to guarantee the Castro government's survival against a possible U.S. invasion. And he says, I got that. The United States has promised to never invade Cuba, and so Castro's government will survive, and nothing really happened. But a lot of leaders in the Soviet Union were really critical of Khrushchev because he risked nuclear war to get that, and in the end he backed down to Kennedy's demands. So the Soviet leaders removed Khrushchev from office 2 years later in '64, largely based on embarrassing the Soviet government in all this. Castro for himself was never even kind of consulted in this deal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, he would deny that for the rest of his life, but historians have pretty well proved that he didn't really have much of a negotiating position. He didn't even have a seat at the table. But Castro will stay in power in Cuba largely for the rest of his life. Kennedy himself was so scared by the Cuban Missile Crisis that quickly after it ended, just a couple months later, he officially ended Operation Mongoose, the whole CIA series of plots to try to overthrow the Castro government by all these kind of crazy cartoonish means we've talked about. So he formally ended that by executive order in January 1963, and he is assassinated later that year, November 1963, so just about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But U.S. foreign policy continues even to today to continue that economic boycott in order to strangle the Cuban economy. U.S. foreign policy after the Cuban Missile Crisis, especially after Kennedy's assassination, will shift much more toward Vietnam starting in 64 and going forward through the rest of the 60s and early 70s. So Cuba becomes more of a kind of afterthought. The U.S. government still hates Castro and hates the Cuban communist economy and all these things, but generally admits that it's going to be really difficult to get him out of power. And from what we know, they generally stop with a lot of those assassination plots. But U.S. foreign policy, economic policy toward Cuba is still to this day to destroy the Castro government. The Obama administration started removing parts of that boycott, and I think it was 2015 or 2016, but the Trump administration went in 2017 and put all that back in place. So there's some back and forth depending on which political party is in power in the United States. But on a larger level, U.S. foreign policy goes much more hardcore anti-communist after the Cuban Revolution, after about 1960. So the U.S. foreign policy will become obsessed with absolute destruction of any group in Latin America or any government that deviates or argues against what the U.S. wants to happen in those areas. So that will lead to the U.S. to intervene in major Latin American countries like Brazil in 1964, Guyana throughout the 1960s, the Dominican Republic in 65, Chile in the 70s, Grenada, and other areas in Central America in the 80s. And of course, other revolutionaries will go into other Latin American countries to try to start guerrilla movements or anti-U.S. movements. The most famous of those is when Che Guevara goes into Bolivia in the mid-1960s to try to start a guerrilla revolutionary movement in Bolivia to overthrow a U.S.-backed government. And we'll talk a lot more about the rest of those countries in the next lecture, in the next few lectures, as we kind of continue talking about Latin America in the wake of the Cuban Revolution and going into the late 1900s.